Welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Play, a show dedicated to the discussion of societal issues within sport. Alongside Katherine Sheridan, I'm Julia Gintof, joined by former MLB player, ESPN analyst, and UConn professor Doug Glanville. Professor Glanville, thanks for joining us once again.
All right, Julia, Katherine, how are you?
Good, good. This week we're tackling gender-based inequities seen recently throughout the sports world, with one that hits particularly close to home. UConn women's rowing filed a Title IX lawsuit just a week ago in wake of the university's choice to cut the program, but this isn't the first gender-related issue raised this year, Katherine.
That's right. Recently, the NCAA has been under fire for the debacle that the women's basketball tournament was. As we saw rather quickly, the news of miniature weight sets and box lunch spread through social media and gained national attention as disparities between the men's tournament were seen from the moment they landed. And to get us started, my first question to you, Professor Glanville, would be, why do you think this happened when they had essentially 2 years to prepare, being that COVID canceled last year's tournament? And then to follow up, do you think that the apology was sufficient?
Well, Katherine, there really is no good answer to that other than this legacy of inequity. And, I think you see often that when, one group has a certain privilege or advantage, it's compounded by all the elements and institution around it that reinforce it. It could be the fact that the media is only going to play a certain sport over and over, and then it justifies itself. So you say, okay, well, I'll give my funding here, I'll put my money here. And when it gets to this kind of granular level, that just shows how little connectivity there is in terms of kind of checking it. When you're recognizing that this is a, March Madness, this tournament has men's and women's teams, and that they're all playing at this high level of excellence. And, you don't have to go far back. I remember Breanna Stewart, I think the NCAA accidentally, tweeted out at one point, oh, well, there's no games on tonight or whatever. And there was women's games happening. So she just got to put it out there. So you're hoping that they're getting more versed in this, but this kind of thing it seems so preventable. And it goes how deep it shows how deep it can go down to the level of just getting facilities organized when you have so much time. So, I don't think it's different from this legacy. I think the question now is, how are they going to make adjustments going forward to not only prevent this, but really work hard to continue to get more equitable conditions and just representation?
Mm-hmm. That was going to be my follow-up too, to go off of that. I was just going to ask you again, do you think this is a result of there not being enough women on these boards that are having these discussions and essentially are in that room? And then it comes down to just a lack of representation, because it's oh, in this type of mindset, am I for this athlete, or am I for this particular women athletics or men's athletics? So,
well, I mean, Katherine, just think about how, imagine Muffet McGraw in the room, right? When they're saying, hey, this is how we're going to do the weight rooms. I mean, that's just not happening, right? I mean, so that's just one example of what representation can do. Now, you being in the room is one thing, but having power and having voice, and that you're heard, and that it's actually part of the implementation strategy, that is another. Because there's a lot of what I call color by numbers, oh, let's just get people in, and they're not heard or listened to. A lot of these ideas, or I should say, a lot of the best suggestions, the best practices have been discussed. There's been many meetings. I think it's more about listening to them and going back, and not only responding to pressure, right? Which unfortunately power tends to do. So we see that a lot. But I do think that you have many great voices out there with power that can be representative. And then when you have this, hey, we're going to put 5 dumbbells in the women's weight room, and then we're going to put a Bally's on the other side, someone's going to go, come on, now, just stop. And that would have just ended it. And, you just didn't see that.
I 100% agree. I think especially coming from a university where women's basketball is basically worshipped, it was even more sad to see the conditions that these athletes were put in, and then just expecting them to perform at the highest level. That's just unbelievable. It was great to see, however, this being the first year that all of the women's games were broadcast nationally. Much of the ratings, I believe for the UConn games at least, were very similar to that of the men. But we can't overlook those discrepancies in the conditions. It just brought to light that we aren't as far as we thought we were. Transitioning to the professional side, though, Professor Glanville, I wanted to get your take on some recent comments made by current players in the pros, particularly NBA player Draymond Green, who is also an analyst on TNT. He went on a whole Twitter rant in March, which I read and many other female athletes read, basically saying that female athletes need to stop complaining and that the pay gap is their own fault. So I sort of wanted to get your take on that situation. He received significant backlash with his comments and then eventually said that they were severely misconstrued. So my first question to this is, as both an athlete and someone who has worked in the industry, is there a line where commentary such as this is unacceptable? And do you feel, as I do, as these comments are just sort of pervading an antagonistic environment towards women in the field?
Well, what I recognize from it is, okay, in some ways, I'm glad he put it out there, right? Because people need to understand, the perceptions and the depth by which this goes. They're sort of like, well, I'm going to do all these things, and then I'm going to reach a line and say, well, okay, I've done enough, right? This is ongoing, all right? This inequities, they don't just go away when your appetite is done with it. Now, he's trying to frame points about storytelling. I think of like Analyze This, Sue Bird's article, which I use in class all the time. And she talks about, the data and the numbers and how if you don't go deep in all sports, in women's sports and men's sports, you don't reach a certain depth, you lose the power to understand the nuance of the greatness, right? You lose the power of seeing that. So if he's talking about like, okay, women need to tell their stories, well, once again, if you have compounding advantage and you're not putting these stories in places, there are a lot of stories out there. There's many stories that have been worked on, but you don't get the opportunity, you don't get the high-end visibility, all these things. Of course, you're not going to be able to get the reach. So it's working from a slanted playing field, and it takes advocates on all levels and all realms of those fields to be able to kind of balance this off more, including Draymond Green, who has to make sure that he's really informed on the issues and not simplifying in a way to say, well, okay, well, if you told your stories or it's just economic, okay, fine. Then he has certain power, right, in these regards. And by the way, we're seeing much more of a corporate responsibility around it. We talked about earlier about how whether Orange Theory or companies stepped in on the weight room debacle and said, we need to do things. That's important because, by the way, those companies that see this also have the ability to sponsor events, pay for advertising, and so, that's what could be encouraging, but it takes all of us. It really takes all of us. And I think it's categorically unfair to, put this all like, okay, put the inequity on women, right? And say, it's like Brenda Tracy would say, like, look, if all this harassment was just a women's problem, we would have solved it already, right? So it's like, you have to recognize your role in this. And Draymond Green is in a league that has the playing field tilted in their favor. And I believe you need to approach that with a certain level of humility.
Yeah, for sure. I think like what you just said about like that resonated with me about like if it was a woman's issue, it had already been fixed, because a lot of things, even away from sports, you kind of look at disparities and you're like, why is this happening? It's like, who's in our way? It's men that either don't understand, they don't want to understand, or they're really greedy. And it's a challenge for us, and it's a challenge for women after that are going to come after me and Julia. And it's like scary to think about, but also encouraging in a way to see like I could be a part of that change. I just want to ask you on a personal level, have you ever found something that works best for you in facilitating and creating an inclusive environment for your female coworkers so that they feel more comfortable, they feel valued, especially in the workforce and in the workplace? Have you done something or found how to best carry yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm working for ESPN for almost 10 years, I suppose now. One transformational moment I would say was working with Jessica Mendoza, and she was part of our class a couple of years ago, actually last year. And I remember looking at her resume, so to speak, and seeing, we're talking about like a gold medalist, Stanford grad, majored Olympian, whatever, probably arguably one of the best softball players of all time. And, it was just to listen to the commentary around her, what was assumed to her capability to be able to cover the sport that I love and that she loves. I think, it's hard for me. I realize that people often stay on the sidelines, right, in silence. And to me, that's a big part of the problem, because, yes, you want to be respectful, because, I don't want to sit here and rant and tell people how they feel when I'm not in this group per se, and sort of dictate that. But at the same time, I believe strongly that I have a role to play and to call stuff out. So I, personally, I wrote an article for the New York Times about her and her experience and how frustrating it was, and just calling out all the hypocrisy behind it. And there's a humility to recognize that you may be part of the problem. I think it's actually a good thing to say that. My gender may give me certain advantages in this field. I have to own that. And it doesn't take away from what I've done or but what it does recognize is, like, there's greatness across the board. And actually it makes us better when we have representation of different voices and vantage points, but because you get a diversity of thought and problem solving, and you start to see yourself in each other's story. I mean, what's so offensive to the UConn family about the weight room is we've watched greatness, perpetual greatness in this basketball program, in women's basketball, forever, right? It seems like, and we know what these women mean to this community. I mean, I have friends all over the place. I play Dungeons and Dragons with my son's, friend's father, and, like, he watches UConn women's basketball like a religion. I mean, that is, so I think when you're in those environments where you see it differently, you can lead in a different way, because you know what it can look like at its best, and how, just think about what I would argue the change agents we've seen, whether it's in the elections and voting. You look at the Atlanta Dream, you think about UConn. I mean, you have Maya Moore, Sue Bird, Brianna Stone. I mean, they are literally changing the world. So, I mean, so to me, it's obvious, but I'm not saying that's there in around the world. So I recognize that, but you have to celebrate these, and you have to keep it under people's nose all the time that they're swimming upstream, and they may be stronger for it, and therefore I think we're gonna have more lessons to learn, and we just need to pay attention. So you gotta advocate, and with humility, and I think the stories are already there for Mr. Draymond Green. The stories are already there. I mean, they're already there. We have to tell them, and you have to recognize that power can be shared, and it's not for you to give it. It's something that we all have, and you have to make room, or just get out of the way, quite frankly.
Yes, I was just gonna say you need to have a conversation with Draymond, but just to reflect before wrapping up, as two women right now, it's a all women's panel, and it's great that we're seeing that. And for two young women who are currently pursuing degrees in the field, it's important that we're having these conversations, because it, like, really hits home for us. I'm not gonna lie, there have been moments even on campus, I think in a scaled back way, but you're definitely being in classes, male dominated classes, even in that, you're kind of like, you feel a sense of a weird dynamic. So it's definitely important that we're having these types of conversations, addressing this very multifaceted issue. And we thank you for joining us, especially with this type of conversation. We need to keep pushing this type of conversation. So we thank you. And on behalf of Julia Gintof, myself, and the whole crew at UCTV Sports, thank you for tuning in to this episode, and we look forward to our next episode, hopefully in person.
All right, Katherine, Julia, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.